about the person who wrote Noach with 7 mistakes, which is pretty hard to do. How do you make 7 mistakes in 2 letters? But I say now I know what that is because I kind of made 7 mistakes in around 5 minutes. So Baruch Hashem, most of what we talked about I think is fine, other than the usual hate mail claims. But I did make around 5 minutes of serious mistake that I do want to correct. And actually I told them not even to post the share until I correct it. And that is the story of the founding of Karaim, and the relationship of Anan ben David and Sadia Gaon. I got it totally messed up, and the problem was basically I was not prepared to talk about it. It just came out, and when it comes to history, you got to really look at your dates ahead of time. So let me give you a short correction about the actual story. First of all, let me give you the dates. Anan died before Rav Sadia Gaon was even born. Anan ben David lived 715 to 795. This is shortly after the Talmud Bavli was completed. Rav Sadia Gaon was born 882 to 942. So their lives did not even overlap. But so let me tell you the story. There is a connection between them, but it's different than what I said. You have to understand that in Bavel, there were 2 different positions of supreme authority over the Jewish population. One position was that of Gaon. Gaon was the head of the yeshivas. Now in Bavel there were 2 big yeshivas. Each of them had Gaonim. The largest and maybe more influential yeshiva was the yeshiva of Sura, that had actually been founded by Rav. The Amora Rav was the one who established that yeshiva, and it lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. There was a smaller yeshiva that was also very chashuv. I mean, there were a lot of small yeshivas, but in terms of authority, in terms of psak halacha, that was the yeshiva of Pumbedisa. So Sura and Pumbedisa were the 2 yeshivos, and the head of which was given the honorary title Gaon. Gaon means excellency. That's why you will find in Rishonim, when the Rishonim refer to certain minhagim, they will say, the minhag of the shtei yeshivos is such and such. The minhag of the 2 yeshivos is such and such a way. They're referring to the yeshivas of Sura and Pumbedisa, which were the halachic authorities, not only for the Jews of Babylonia, which is Iraq, but really the Jews all over the place, Eretz Yisrael, Europe, etc., Spain, right? These were the Gaonim. This is the period before the Rishonim, and that ended around the year 1000 with the death of Rav Hai Gaon. At some point, the Persian government just destroyed the yeshivos, and then you get to the Rishonim, Rabbeinu Gershom, which is already France, Germany, etc. There was a movement away from Bavel. Now, that is one position of authority. That is called the Gaonim. But there's another position of authority that was actually older than the Gaonim, and that's called Reish Galusa. Now, the Gemara itself refers to Reish Galusa. And this continued in the period of the Gaonim. Reish Galusa literally means the head of the exile, and the minhag was that the Jewish people were given a certain amount of political autonomy by the Persian rulers, and the political head, like the president of the Jewish community, was the Reish Galusa. Sometimes the Reish Galusa was a Talmid Chacham, sometimes the Reish Galusa was not a Talmid Chacham. He was just a powerful guy. He was a politician. He's somebody who got himself appointed, and he could levy taxes and make all sorts of decisions. You see in the Gemara many times that there were conflicts between the Tanoim and Amoraim against the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa wanted to do something, it wasn't halachically right? So the relationship of the Reish Galusa to the Chachamim, whether the Gaonim or just the Chachamim generally, the Tanoim and Amoraim, was at times a very, very strained relationship, and at times it was a good relationship. But these are 2 different positions. The Gaonim are the heads of the yeshivas of Sura and Pumbedisa. The Reish Galusa was the head of the political structure of Am Yisrael. Now, the thing was that Anan ben David was not in, this is where I have to correct myself, he was not in contention to be a Rosh Yeshiva. Perhaps he was not as big a Talmid Chacham as would have been the case had he been thinking about the job of the Gaon of Sura, but he was in line to be Reish Galusa. And the story goes that because it went to another relative, it didn't go to him, he was so upset that he went and he started, because the Gaonim sided with the contender, and therefore he wanted to reject the oral Torah, reject everything it stood for, and he created the religion that became known as Karaim, or actually Karaim is the name of the people, the Karaites, etc. Okay, so Rav Saadia Gaon was not involved in any of this. Rav Saadia Gaon wasn't even born yet. Okay? But what happened was that he did create a movement, and many people followed his movement. Karaites grew and grew and grew till many thousands of Karaites. Now, Rav Saadia Gaon was born almost 90 years after Anan died, right? Anan died in 795. Rav Saadia Gaon was born in 882. So their lives did not overlap. But Rav Saadia Gaon did face a huge Karaite population, particularly in Mitzrayim, which is where he was born. He was born in Egypt. So at the age of 23, a young man, he began to write refutations of Karaite philosophy, pointing out the mistakes and distortions of Anan ben David, who had been the founder of Karaite. So yes, Rav Saadia Gaon did fight Anan ben David, but it was posthumously. It was after Anan's death, and it was a literary fight in which he wrote svarim against the Karaites. Now, Rav Saadia Gaon, he was not called Gaon then because he was just Saadia, right? He was not. He did not have the position. Eventually developed a great reputation, and he finally was eventually offered when he was 45 years old, and that was young. He was very young. He was offered to be the Gaon of Surah, based on these writings and other writings as well. Now you have to know that this was very unusual for two reasons. Number one, it was unusual because this was extremely young. A Gaon of Surah typically would be the end of his life. You're 60, you're 70, you're given this great honor. To be given this honor at the age of 45 was really unparalleled. And number two, another reason that this was so unusual is the Gaonim of Surah and Pumbedisa were always promoted from within, meaning you were a student or a Rebbe in the Yeshiva of Surah, so you got promoted. Rav Saadia Gaon never learned in Surah. He was not a Talmud of the Gaonim. He was totally from the outside. So to kind of invite, in fact, he was the first, or maybe the only Gaon, I know he was the first, maybe even the only, who became the Gaon of Surah without having any connection to Surah. And at one point, by the way, he got into a fight with the Reish Galusa, not Anan, and the Reish Galusa deposed him, and he went back into exile for a few years till he came back. It was a very productive exile. He actually wrote a number of svarim. He was freed from the responsibility of Gaon. He actually did. He wrote some svarim that way. So I just wanted to correct it. I made a lot of mistakes yesterday. I said that Anan was a contender for Rosh Yeshiva of Surah. That's not true. Anan was fighting with Rav Saadia Gaon. That is not true. So I don't want to leave you, even though it's not Nogei L'Halakha or anything, I don't want to leave you with erroneous information. So I apologize, and I hope the correction clarifies things. And I want to thank Yaakov for being meramis to me that maybe Anan was looking for Reish Galusa. That's 100% correct. So thank you. Yeah.
So how do we reconcile the fact that yesterday was a big question that the Karaites started from Anan? Is that what we said?
Anan was the founder, yeah.
Right, and there was a big problem because we said that he was a huge Talmud, or we thought he was a huge Talmud,
yeah.
And then that led to the question of, so for them, they know halacha and they went completely against it, but their kids...
That's the right. The Rambam does say that.
Right,
yeah.
so then do we still hold...
Yes. The truth is, Anan does... Anan may not have been the Talmud Chacham who could have been Gaon of Surah, but in point of fact, Anan was learned. Anan wrote a svarim espousing his philosophy of Karaitism, and from those svarim it shows that he had some knowledge of things. So everything we said on that point is still valid. I just needed to correct that he was not seeking the Gaonship of Surah, he was seeking to be Reish Galusa. Now, historically, by the way, the Reish Galusa in Bavel was a descendant of David HaMelech. They tried to find people who connected to the Davidic monarchy, so in a sense they looked at the Reish Galusa as a hemshech of Malchus Beis David. And usually that was the case. Anan's father was David. I don't know if he himself was a descendant of David HaMelech or not. I mean, his father was David. That doesn't mean anything, obviously. And by the way, we daven every Shabbos for the Reish Galusa. I hope you noticed that. In Yakum Purkan, right, the prayer in Aramaic that we say at the beginning of Musaf. So we say, L'Reishe Galvasa U'Ledayana Di Masifta. He says, we pray for the Reish Galusa and the judges in the yeshiva. Now, the truth of the matter is, this was written in the time of the Gaonim of Babel, and the question is, it refers to some positions that are extinct. We pray for the Reish Galusa. Tell me, who is the Reish Galusa that we're praying for? Like, what do we mean even by the phrase Reish Galusa? Okay, the judges of yeshiva, you could say in a more general way, are the Dayanim, the Talmidei Chachamim, etc. But look at Yakum Porka and you will see that it is very specifically worded towards the positions that existed in the time of the Gaonim. It was a prayer that was added by the Gaonim, and it was said in Aramaic because this was a language that everybody understood. In Babel, that was the language. Hebrew was not the language. And they wanted people to have kavanah specifically for the leaders. It's similar to the prayer that you have for the president or whatever it would be. There are prayers for the government. The Reish Galusa was the head of the Jewish government in Babel. Again, you can write a whole book just to gather the agaditas about the relationship of our Chachamim and the Reish Galusa. It goes up and down and up and down and up and down. There were Amoraim who were the sons-in-law. There's a phrase in the Gemara, Chasna de Bein Nasiya. That means the son-in-law of the Nasi. That means somebody who married the daughter of the Reish Galusa. It was called the Chasna de Bein Nasiya. And we use that phrase today. If somebody marries, let's say, Rav Chaim Kanevsky's daughter or something, it'll say Chasna de Bein Nasiya. It's a borrowed phrase. But originally it was referring to the Reish Galusa. Okay, any questions about that? So again, I apologize for the mistakes. Okay, let's go back to our listing here. Kofrei Batorah. We can't seem to get away from Kofrei Batorah. And let me just mention, again, what is perplexing in particular is part 3 of Kofrei Batorah. Right, the first part is your Kofrei in the divinity of the Torah Shebechsav. Okay, that's relatively straightforward. The second is your Kofrei in the divinity of Torah Shebal Peh. Okay. The third is Kofrei or Makrish, you contradict Magidaha. Magidaha are the transmitters of the Torah Shebal Peh. That refers to the idea that, I accept the Torah Shebal Peh, but I think it was corrupted, I think it was changed, I think there were distortions introduced. So the Rambam says that's just as bad, and indeed, as I indicated yesterday, that may have been part of the Karaite heresy, in which, maybe there is an oral law, but I'm not going to take it from these guys because they could have added all sorts of things. Now, the question, though, the big question becomes, though, and I don't have a full answer for this, who is called a Magid of Torah? I mean, Makrish, you deny Magidaha. Magidaha means the authority of those who are Magid, those who are declaring the oral law. Right? I'm kaifer in their authenticity, in their authority. So apparently there's an important character here to be identified called a Magid. A Magid is a communicator, a narrator, a transmitter of the oral law. And when you deny the authority, authenticity of that transmitter, the Rambam says that is called a Kofrei Batorah she'ein lo chelek l'olam haba. So this is a term that the Rambam made up. I mean, Chazal they don't use the specific language, a Magid of Torah Shebal Peh, but this is the Rambam's term. And the question is, what does he mean by that? I mean, Rabbi Yashiv gave a psak, right? So I would be stupid, I would be foolish to be cholek in Rabbi Yashiv. But let's assume that I learned the sugya, or you learned the sugya, and you conclude that Rabbi Yashiv, again, this would be stupid and wrong. I'm not denying that. But you were to conclude that maybe Rabbi Yashiv didn't fully understand something, and I learned the sugya, and I have a different pshat, and therefore I think the halacha is different. Again, stupid, foolish, wrong. That's not the issue. But am I a kofar that I don't have a chelek in olam haba because he is a transmitter of Torah Shebal Peh? I really don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case. In fact, you have the right, again, it's a right that you shouldn't exercise, but you have the right to learn a sugya, and if you do so conscientiously, to come to halachic conclusions. Only when there's a Sanhedrin do you lose that right. When there's a Sanhedrin, so even if I'm a gadol mamish, even if I'm greater than the people who happen to be on the Sanhedrin, which is possible, right? You could have a person who, for whatever reason, maybe he's old, he doesn't have children. I mean, there are psulim on the Sanhedrin that have nothing to do with your greatness in Torah. So it is possible, keep in mind, that you could have a gadol not on the Sanhedrin who might be greater than members of the Sanhedrin. That's entirely possible. But if they paskin, it is asur di'araisa for that chacham to paskin differently. Okay? But that's only when there's a Sanhedrin. When you're talking about, let's say, a contemporary gadol, Rabbi Yoshev. I use Rabbi Yoshev as an example. So as I say, for me to say, oh, I disagree with him, I think he's wrong, is, again, I'll repeat, stupid, unwise, erroneous, for sure. But it's not kaifer. Do I have the right to argue with him? I have the right. It's a right that I shouldn't exercise. It's a foolish exercise of a right. But under no circumstances can I be called a kofar b'Torah if I came to a different opinion. So the Rambam certainly doesn't mean that a person who learns through a sugya and feels that a certain psak is wrong is a kofar in the magidim of the Torah Shebal Peh. But I think there has to be a chiluk here between maybe interpretation and transmission, meaning the following. When a posek is asked the shaila today, the posek is not rummaging in the back of his mind, oh, what did God tell me about that? A psak is not going to be, oh, Hashem told me this. In fact, the other way around, that's lo b'shamayim, that's not even admissible. A posek is using svara, a posek is using logic, a posek is using rayos, a posek is using precedent. So he's not transmitting Torah Shebal Peh. He's interpreting Torah Shebal Peh. So when it comes to interpretation, a Sanhedrin would be the end of the road, can't go beyond that. But interpretation, I have the right. Again, I'm always afraid of hate mail. I'm not saying you should. It's stupid to do it. It's wrong to do it. For sure, Rabbi Yoshev got it better than us. That's not a question. All I'm saying is, you're not a kofar b'Torah if you say Rabbi Yoshev is wrong. It's not shaykh. Because you can interpret things your way, and he interpreted things his way. So when the Rambam says kofar b'magidah, I think he's limiting it to a certain category where someone is transmitting, like a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. They're transmitting it as a coming down from Hashem or an earlier Messiah. So for you to then say, oh, I deny the authenticity of it, I think he made it up, that would be makrish magidah. Or alternatively, maybe the Rambam means Sanhedrin. In other words, vis-a-vis a non-Sanhedrin person, it could only be a matter of transmission. Vis-a-vis the Sanhedrin, it would even include interpretation. Meaning, if I simply say the Sanhedrin got it wrong, even though in learning I'm allowed to say that. Actually, in learning I am allowed to say that. But in practice, I am not allowed to say that. Meaning, I can say the Sanhedrin was wrong. But the halacha that I have to follow is based on that. And if I teach you don't have to follow the Sanhedrin, I would be called a makrish in Torah Shebal Peh, in Magidah. Right, so that might be another possibility. But again, as I say, it's not shaykh, it's not reasonable to say that every time you have a machlokas on what a gadol said, you fall in the category of makrish. I mean, first of all, gedolim argue with gedolim. That obviously is not a problem. But I'm suggesting even a non-gadol who argues with the gadol is not a makrish in Torah Shebal Peh. He's simply an idiot. Okay, an idiot. Okay, you're allowed to be an idiot. Although the Kofrei Rebbe says being an idiot is the biggest crime, but okay. But being an idiot is not the same as being a kofrei, and that's important to know the difference. Yeah.
Would Rambam say that Simchus is a kofrei because he denies a certain halacha, Moshe Sinai, in Bava Kama?
Yeah. Well, this is an enormous kasha. If you recall, the Rambam actually says in the Perish Mishnayos that there will never be a machlokas if something is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, because that would imply a break in transmission and a mistake in transmission, and that would be kfirah to even believe such a thing. And that's why he says there will always be universal agreement among chachamim on halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Now that's the Rambam statement. He makes the statement more than once, as you correctly point out. The problem is we do have a number of instances, that's one of them, in which there is apparently a machlokas, whether something is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That is a big tzorech iyud on the Rambam. Yeah.
So I suppose the third one, he's addressing how the Karaites say that we don't have this transmission anymore, so we deny, maybe there was a Torah al-Peh, we deny that there was a transmission.
Yeah.
But how do we address certain issues within Orthodox Judaism where we ourselves sort of deny small things, like we'll say, oh, we don't really know what Chelek is anymore, or there's certain things that happen in Beit HaMikdash they argue about in the Gemara, and they say we don't know what this is. So what is the difference between us and them? Is it just a matter of degree? Or is there something?
Well, we do admit there are certain things that get forgotten. I think the difference might be distortion versus forgetting, meaning to say whatever we have is what we have, and we don't assume there's a distortion, but there is the possibility of forgetting some other details or the like with the passage of time. In other words, shichacha is not the same as distortion, meaning what we preserve is accurate, but there may be things that for whatever reason was not completely preserved. Even by techelas, I don't want to get into techelas, that's always a big topic in and of itself. But there's a Rashmos in the Ram. Somebody asked me the question, why do talesim have stripes? Most talesim, right, have black stripes. Some have blue stripes, like the flag of Israel, and some people have multicolored, but that's already a different thing. But and there are talesim without stripes. There are, and vadai, it's kosher if you have a four-cornered talis without any stripes. It's certainly a kosher talis. So what is the makor of black stripes? Black is the most common color for these stripes. So it's interesting that one of the makoros is it's a zecher to techelas, that we lost techelas for so many centuries without discussing whether we regained it. So even though we don't have techelas on the tzitzis, we want to remember the techelas by having the color of techelas on the talis. Now the obvious question is, well, wait a minute. A black stripe is not the color of techelas. Techelas is said to be blue. The truth is, it's not so pashut. The Rambam implies it's such a dark shade of even darker than navy blue, that indeed the Rambam seems to indicate that the chelas was a black color. Now it's interesting that is not followed, even among the people who do techelas today. They follow the Rambam's opinion as to how many strings and how you tie the knots. As far as I know, nobody does black, and I may wonder if that's a question. From the Murex, I don't know if you could get a black color. I don't know. So b'chlal, that might be a little bit of a riot. By the way, other people say that's not the reason. They say the other way around, that the black is a zecher l'chorban. It's like a bit of a mourning document that we kind of remember. In fact, it's interesting. I have a little bit of a riot to that. This was very striking. I haven't seen it since, but I remember around 20 years ago, I was at the Kaisel for Tisha B'Av. Maybe I don't see it because I don't go to the Kaisel Tisha B'Av usually. But I saw a Sephardic guy sitting on the ground, and he wore a totally black talis. The whole talis was black. Very, very striking. So that indicates that a black talis was a zecher l'chorban. So some want to say that the black stripes are also a zecher l'chorban, like a partial zecher l'chorban. Yeah.
So I might have missed this, but did we say the transmitters that ended, is Chazal considered transmitters, or are they also interpreters?
So that's the issue. When does transmitters, right? Transmitters of Torah Shabbat pass. So there's no question, as long as there was a Sanhedrin, they were the transmitters. Now the Sanhedrin was eventually abolished. Remember, the Sanhedrin does not depend on the Beis HaMikdash, actually. There was a Sanhedrin even after the Churban, Beis HaMikdash. They moved from Yerushalayim, they went up north, Beit Sha'arim, Tiberia, etc. The Sanhedrin is an institution that can exist independently of the Beis HaMikdash, but the Sanhedrin does require one thing that we don't have today, and that is Semicha. Let me talk about this a little bit. Semicha is ordination. Now, we commonly say, oh, this rabbi got Semicha from here and here. So I hate to tell you this, it's a declaration against my interest, but all of us rabbis are a bunch of liars. None of us have Semicha. I do not have any Semicha whatsoever. And, even people much, 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 much greater than me, Rebbe Yashiv didn't have Semicha, okay? So what's going on? Are we frauds? So, well, maybe some of us are, but the thing is, what you have when you're a rabbi, we call it Semicha, but it's not real Semicha. We call it Heter Hora'ah. We were given permission by our teachers, being tested or whatever it is, to be able to paskin. It's like a certificate of competence on some level. Okay? It's not real Semicha. Real Semicha is an unbroken chain of ordination from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu put his hands, literally, on 70 elders, transmitting spiritual authority. And they in turn ordained other people. And that went on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. You can't have a Sanhedrin without Semicha. Now, how did Semicha end? During the Roman persecutions, it just happened to be that the Romans, after Hadrian, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, were killing many of the sages, and they actually made it a capital offense to ordain. And people would ordain in secret, but it happened to be that the last person that had Semicha was killed before he could transmit, and that was in around the 5th century. This is more than 300 years after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and that represented the end of the Sanhedrin. There's no Semicha anymore. Now, the question you're asking is a very good question. So when there's so this happened, again, just in terms of years, this was in the middle of the Amoraim, like the time of Abaye of Arava. They were in Bavel, but around that time is when Semicha stopped. Okay? So the question then becomes, so who are the transmitters of Torah after that point? The Rambam is mashma in the Hakdama that all of the Amoraim in Shas are considered to be a chalakim of those transmitters, what we call Chazal, even post-Sanhedrin. It's not clear how he gets that. It's not pashut. I mean, once you look at people beyond the Sanhedrin, it's hard to know why anybody has a special role. In other words, Gedol, you have Gedolim, right? Gedolim, okay, Rishonim. I mean, what was Rashi? But yet the Rambam seems to indicate that all of Chazal that are in the Talmud, Hanoim and Amoraim, have this status of Magidei Torah, right? And the Rambam lists them. By the way, let me just mention, there is a passage in the Rambam that says the following. The Rambam says, he doesn't say it here, but he says it in Parish and Mishnayos elsewhere, that before Mashiach comes, we should reestablish the Sanhedrin. Because only when we have our shoftim, as we should have them, will the Geula come. So the question becomes, without Semicha, how do you reestablish a Sanhedrin to bring Mashiach? So the Rambam says a chiddush, and this is very unusual. Almost everything the Rambam says, he always has a source in the Babylonian Talmud, the Yerushalmi, the Medrashei Halacha, the Tosefta. Everything the Rambam says, every sentence in the Mishnah Torah at least, has a makor. Now the Rambam doesn't tell you the makor. That's what the commentaries do, the Kesef Mishnah and the like. And sometimes the Rambam didn't remember his makor. He would sometimes be asked, "Where did you get this?" And the Rambam didn't remember because it was not in an obvious place. Remember, Din of Ir Miklat was not in Makos. It was some unusual place, and the Rambam had to look around to find it. And he even expressed regret Why didn't he write footnotes? Why didn't he make a record of where we got everything? But almost everything, 90% of everything the Rambam says, is a direct source. But every once in a while, less than 100 times in the whole Mishnah Torah, the Rambam says something, Yireli, it appears to me. And this is a Yireli. And the Rambam says, if all of the Chachamim of Israel, that's also ambiguous, Chachmei Yisrael, does that mean Jewish Chachamim? Or the Chachamim of Eretz Yisrael? A little bit of an ambiguity. Do you count Chutz La'aretz people? But the Rambam says, if all of the Chachmei Yisrael decide that there is somebody who deserves to have Semicha, they can create Semicha out of nothing. They can ordain, and once that person is ordained, he could give Semicha to other people, and you can have a Sanhedrin. An amazing chiddush. The Rambam says you can create Semicha out of nothing with the haskama of Kol Chachmei Yisrael, but he ends his chiddush, this is Yirali, this is his chiddush, he ends with Hadavar Tzarech Hechra. The matter requires further investigation, meaning he wasn't 100% sure about this. Now the Rambam wrote this in the 1100s. Fast forward to the 1500s, after the Spanish Inquisition, Rav Yosef Karo was in Sfat. His Rebbe was a great posek, obviously, called Rav Yaakov Beirav. And Rav Yaakov Beirav very much wanted to create a Sanhedrin and reinstitute Semicha, because he thought that would bring the Geula, that would bring Mashiach. Because when you create a Sanhedrin again, you're zocheh to the coming of Mashiach. So based on this Rambam, he had the Chachamim of Tzfat, which were the majority of the Chachamim. So firstly, he's going with majority, he's not counting Chutz La'aretz, and he's going with the majority of Chachamim, not everybody. And the majority were in Tzfat more than Yerushalayim. They gave him Semicha, and then he ordained Rav Yosef Karo and the Mabit, a few, like 3 or 4 Talmidim. And later, they in turn ordained other Talmidim in an attempt that eventually they wanted to have a critical mass where they could be miyaseh a Sanhedrin. The Chachmei Yerushalayim, led by Rav Levi ibn Chaviv, called the Maral Bach, Rav Levi ben Chaviv, ben is ibn Chaviv. His father wrote the Ein Yaakov, Rav Yaakov ben Chaviv. So this is the son of they called the Maral Bach. He wrote Shelos Tshuvas. Was a great misnage to this idea, and he wrote a number of tshuvas going back and forth. And because of this, the idea of Semicha became aborted. It did not get continued. It was voluntarily discontinued. But every once in a while, people try to resuscitate this Rambam to be Machadesh a Sanhedrin. Bisman Hazeh, in 1948, with the establishment of the State of Israel, and some people looked at it as a messianic event. And the first minister of religion, he's not well regarded in the Haredi world, but he was a Talmud Chacham. You can't take it away. Rav Yehuda Leib Maimon very much wanted to be Machadesh Sanhedrin based on this Rambam. And even in later years, people are talking about, there actually is a body in Jerusalem called the Sanhedrin, but it was headed by Rabbi Steinsaltz. But he himself said it was not a real Sanhedrin, it was just a practice run. On the other hand, that's what he said, but there were other people who looked at it differently. They actually looked at it and look at it as a Sanhedrin. Suffice it to say that Gedolim like the Brisker Rav, going back to 1948, were extremely against this. They thought that recreating a Sanhedrin is like putting a machine gun in the hands of a 2-year-old. What type of havoc? You have a Sanhedrin. They make new takanos, new gezeros. They repeal old takanos and old gezeros. He says it would be like a Hefkerwelt, in which a lot of Judaism could be destroyed because nobody was worthy of being on the Sanhedrin. So it's an idea that pops out here and there in maybe fringe, more leftist groups, I would say. But it is based on the Rambam, and in the 1500s, it actually was put into it actually was done by very chashuv gedalim, Rav Yaakov ben Rav Yosef Karo. Although it's always interesting that when you give somebody smicha today, let's say our fake smicha. So what do we test people on? We test people on the Shulchan Aruch. So like Rav Yosef Karo got tested on the book he wrote. Now Shulchan Aruch wasn't written yet, but like he wrote the book, right? And but he actually technically, at least like his Rebbe had real smicha, but we don't. As they say, we are all fakers. But as they say, the mystery of who is Magidaha, certainly it's the Sanhedrin. Beyond the Sanhedrin, the Rambam seems to say it embraces Chazal, but it vaday, the one thing I can say for sure is, it vaday does not preclude you from being cholek and even a gadol. As they say, I will repeat this for the 5th time, it's stupid, you're probably wrong, for sure, but you are not a kofar if you come to a conclusion in halacha keneged what a gadol says, because you looked at it, you looked at the sources, you came to your conclusion. That's not kfira, that is simply machlokas. And in machlokas, I need to know my limitations, for sure, but that doesn't enter into any shaila of kfira under any definition, under any reasonable definition of that term. Yeah.
Was there a Sanhedrin or an attempt at a Sanhedrin by Napoleon?
Oh yeah. So that's another thing. So that was totally fake, and everybody admitted this. Napoleon, one of the things Napoleon did was Napoleon emancipated the Jewish populations from the ghetto, and he gave them a lot of freedoms. That was his thing. By the way, the Alter Rebbe thought that was very dangerous. When Napoleon invaded Russia, and the condition of the Jews in Russia under the Tsar was absolutely awful, the Alter Rebbe prayed that the Tsar would win, and he even raised money for the Tsar, because he said, the Tsar destroys our bodies, Napoleon will destroy our neshama. Because by giving us all these freedoms, Jews are going to leave the Torah and the like. And indeed, that is the case. The end result of all of these emancipations were the Reform movement and the Haskalah and the like. They came out of the freedom, the new freedoms that Jews were given. Again, not that we ask for oppression, but it happens to be historically, Jews do better religiously under bad conditions than they do under good conditions. Somehow good conditions, we become hefker and everything else. So one of Napoleon's shtick was he wanted to assemble 70 rabbis, that they should be a Sanhedrin to make various rules and regulations. Now obviously the only one who said this was a Sanhedrin was Napoleon himself. The rabbis knew it was no Sanhedrin, but they figured they would participate because if they didn't do it, people who were less able and less competent would step in. So there were Gedolim on Napoleon's Sanhedrin, but they made it very, very clear that they did not regard themselves as a Sanhedrin, and they did nothing that a Sanhedrin would do. They didn't make takonos or kseros. They were essentially, kind of the government and bureaucratic structure for the Jewish communities. Yeah.
I hope it's okay to go back to an earlier point about how, like, somebody who would say that they're Chelek on Rav Elyashiv is, like, stupid.
Yeah.
I feel like that answer isn't enough for me, because I've met, like, really brilliant people that would say things like that. Like, they're really, like, went through the, like, they know more Torah than I'll ever know.
So they have the right. They have the right. They do have the right. I mean, the Vilna Gaon, we don't teach this today and we don't do this today, but the Vilna Gaon said to Rav Chaim Volozhiner, who of course was much greater than any of us, but he said that if you learn a sugya and you think the Shulchan Aruch is not a correct psak, you're not mechuyev to follow the Shulchan Aruch even. And the implication is this. This is the mysterious category. If you are a yachid shehigia lahora'ah, that means you are a person who reached the level of being able to paskin. The Vilna Gaon says, you're not bound by anything after the Gemara. You're not bound by Rishonim, you're not bound by Achrayim, not just contemporary Gedolim. If you're Higia Lahora, you have the right, the Vilna Gaon says, to paskin based on the Gemara itself. Now, that technically is true, which means, according to that, I talked about Rabbi Yashiv. Let's say something, I'm going to get mail here, okay. Let's take a bigger example. Let's assume a person is Chelek on Rashi. A much bigger example. I'm chilek. Rashi got it wrong. Now, again, stupid, not right, no good. But I would submit that that is not a kofar b'Torah. The Vilna Gaon says, it's a mystery why the Gemara is even binding, but okay, but let's take that as a given. The Gemara is binding. But if I think that the sugya is not what Rashi says, or not what Tosfos says, or not what the Rashba says, I am not a kofar b'Torah if I follow my interpretation. So the rule that we always say a rule, right? We're taught a rule. Rishon cannot argue on an Amora, okay. An Acharon cannot argue on a Rishon. Those are not really rules. Those are good advice. Meaning, an Acharon doesn't argue on a Rishon because the Rishon was much greater than me, so what's my point? But if you're asking me, am I a kofar b'Torah? I say I'm not a kofar. Even if one would argue on Rashi, one is not a kofar b'Torah. Okay? So yeah, there may be somebody, I mean, and that's the key. You know, the way they teach the rule, it's so artificial. They say, an Acharon is not allowed to argue with the Rishon except the Vilna Gaon. Well, who gave him permission? I mean, you know, when the Vilna Gaon applied for like a Rishon license that he could argue with the Rishon, like, you know, you have to understand, this is not some fake rule that says nobody can argue with the Rishon except for the Vilna Gaon. Rather, this is expressing the Vilna Gaon's own shita generally. A yachid shehigia lahayra is not bound by anything after the Gemara. So the only reason why an Acharon does not argue with the Rishon is really simply because I'm not on the Madrega. But theoretically, a Yachid who's honest, who's not a Balgaiva, might come to such a conclusion. The Vilna Gaon came to that conclusion occasionally. And it's not just the Vilna Gaon. Sometimes the Chazon Ish does it, sometimes, not that much. And the Rogatchover for sure did. The Rogatchover for sure did it. The Rogatchover was a little more generous than the Gemara. He went up to the Rambam. But anything after the Rambam, he Bechlal did not pay attention to, including the Shulchan Aruch, including the Ramah. The Rogatchover said, I don't read these books, whatever it would be. So the point I'm making is, there is a principle here that we generally do not follow because of knowing our Madrega. But that is a principle there. You know, it's not. So when people use the word, again, I've said it a million times already, when people call you a kofar Batorah because, you know, you're cholek on a certain gadol, it's the wrong vocabulary. I mean, maybe we have to use it because maybe there's not another way of describing it. It's a bad thing. It is a bad thing. For sure it's a bad thing. But it is not nichlal in this, in what the Rambam is talking about as a kofar makhish b'magidaha and ein lo chelek l'olam haba. I don't think that's the case. Now, I will say something else. We didn't learn it yet. There is another way you can lose your olam haba, which is not this, but that's if you're mavazeh a Talmid Chacham. Now that's a totally different parsha, and that is, I can argue with Rebbe Yashiv, even though I'm probably wrong. But if I'm mevazeh a Talmid Chacham, I would say, God forbid, he's stupid, he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's an independent basis for losing Olam Haba. But that's not Kfir b'Torah. That's going to be a separate category of mevazeh Talmid Chacham. Yeah.
Have there been any notable people who were like Yachid in the last 100 years?
Well, if you ask me, are there? Of course there were. The question is, did they take advantage of the? I mean, of course, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rabbi Yashiv, Rav Ovadia Yosef. I mean, they're all Higiel Lahara. Of course, they're Higiel Lahara. But the question is, they generally did not assume these. Not too much. The Rogatchover was the most outstanding example, most recent example, and the Rogatchover was kind of an unusual person in that way. But the Rogatchover is Kamat the only one. Now, I'll say this though, Rav Moshe Feinstein was someone like that he wouldn't be Chelek on Rishonim. He was not Chelek on Rishonim, but he was certainly Chelek on even the earliest Achronim. He would go back to the Gemara and learn the Rishonim and come to his own independent judgment, Keneged, like all the Achronim. Rav Moshe did that. But even Rav Moshe, wasn't Chelek on Rishonim, but he did go back and kind of ignore all of the Acharayim. If you compare, I'll give you an example in style. If you compare a tshuva of, let's say, Rav Ovadia Yosef and a tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, you see a very, very different style. When Rav Ovadia writes a tshuva on any halachic matter, he will bring in like every sefer that ever discussed this topic. And maybe you've heard of 50% of them, the other 50% you didn't even hear of. He'll bring you, and how he had that memory is just unbelievable, but just, he'll tell you, and then he'll count them up and say, okay, there are 75 poskim that matter, and there are only 65 who aser, therefore, based on Rov, we're going to be mekel. I'm simplifying this a little bit, because he read like every sefer ever written on any topic. You look at Rav Moshe, Rav Moshe doesn't bring anything. Rav Moshe goes through the Gemara and then goes through Rashi and Tosfos and the Rambam, and maybe brings the Noda B'Yehuda, the Chassam Sefer, and Rebbe Kiva Eger. Like the only three Acharayim Rav Moshe brings. Once in a while, somebody else. And Rav Moshe goes to the Gemara and says, based on the Gemara and based on the way the Rambam understands the Sugya, this is going to be my Psak Halacha. It's a very different way of paskening. It's not a psak based on looking at what everybody else wrote. It's exercising independent judgment. And indeed, Rav Moshe writes in the Hakdama to the first Chelek of Igros Moshe, he says, when a Yachid is Higia L'Hara, he has a responsibility to independently decide what the halacha is. He cannot evade that responsibility, and even if he's wrong, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him that authority, and therefore it'll be okay. In Shemaim, it'll be okay if he worked as hard as he could work. So Rav Moshe essentially followed exactly what he said his Hakdama was. The only thing is, he didn't go as far as the Vilna Gaon. That's what I'm saying. According to the Vilna Gaon, once you're Gil Hara, you could be Chelek on Rishayim. So that, there are madregas. Rav Moshe held he Gil Hara, but not to be Chelek on the Rishayim. In fact, it's often the case. Rav Moshe has a tshuva, and people would tell him, the Shayalu Meshiv says either like you or not like you. He would often say, he says, I don't have the sefer. I I didn't see. In other words, he was machabed people. He wasn't mavaza, but he said, I don't have to look around at every single sefer. So it's very different derech in psak than Rav Ovadia. Okay, see you. Take care. Have a good day.